Welcome to the BrainShape podcast, hosted by Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, a show where we cut through the noise of the ever-growing, ever-changing world of brain health. What works and what doesn't, what's fact and what's fiction. We look at tips, tools, and techniques backed up by real scientific studies to help you keep your brain healthy and hopefully have some fun along the way. Now, here's your host, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson.
You're listening to the BrainShape podcast, episode number 4. The food we eat is an essential part of our lives. Our bodies need food and nutrition to function, and the specific types of food that we consume can help to fuel our bodies and our brains, as well as help to promote longevity. Today we're talking with Dr. Carol Greenwood, a senior scientist at Baycrest's Rotman Research Institute and a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto's Department of Nutritional Sciences. She is a co-author of Mindful, the first science-based e-cookbook for the brain, and has also co-authored the first Canadian brain health food guide. In this episode, we'll be talking about the role that our diet plays in fueling our brains, the importance of broadly considering our nutritional needs, also known as our global diet, instead of focusing too much on a single type of food, nutrient, or spice, and why we also need to think about the social context in which we prepare and consume our food to optimize our brain health. At the very end of this episode, Carol shares an exciting opportunity with listeners to get involved in a clinical trial taking place at Baycrest to investigate the impact of healthy eating on improving blood flow to the brain and improving cognitive performance. So let's get to our chat with Carol about brain healthy foods and some of the tips you can use to make healthy eating your go-to option. Here we go. Here's Dr. Carol Greenwood. Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, it's very nice to be here. Thank you so much.
I'm really looking forward to our chat about brain health and food. It's a topic that I'm so fascinated with. So I'm just wondering if you could start with telling the listeners a little bit about yourself and your history.
I'm a traditional nutritionist in terms of training. I did my PhD in nutrition and I became interested in the role of diet in terms of maintaining brain health, probably close to 30 years ago, and have been working in that area more or less throughout my professional career. And then in the last maybe decade, a lot of that focus really turned towards issues around brain aging, maintaining cognition with aging, and looking at ways that we can lower our dementia risk. So I've been kind of at that nutrition-brain interface for quite a period of time now.
And what are some of the benefits that you can share with listeners about the impact of healthy eating on brain function as we age?
Well, it's interesting, and I think the interesting piece is how our understanding has changed over the years, because I know that, we went through a period of time where there was a focus very much in terms of brain development, which is really important, and making sure that we were feeding the brain correctly. And over time, I think we've realized that the brain, like every tissue in our body, really is reliant on healthy nutrition throughout its lifespan. And not only, I think, in terms of looking at maintaining the health of what I call south of the neck, so making sure our blood vessels stay healthy so that we get a good supply of nutrients to the brain, but then also making certain that the brain has the nutrients that it needs in order to be able to function. And if any of those things start to diminish, that's when we start to run into problems that can actually either be the beginning of early disease or alternatively could accelerate any disease that was there. So it's really it's a lifelong issue, and it's really looking at recognizing that the brain has its own needs for nutrition the same way that our heart and our muscles do.
Are there some common myths that you hear that people that you interact with hear that you would like to sort of bust on the show, that there are some myths around the impact of diet and brain health? So for example, you can never have too much of a good thing, but we actually know.
Well, that for certain is true. That we there's always concerns that we'll overdo and take levels of nutrients that can ultimately become toxic for the body. But I think it's also, I hear a lot of people focusing on single foods or single nutrients, and I think that's also not the right approach. That we really need to have all of the nutrients in our diet, and no one single food is going to be able to do that. So, for instance, I constantly ask if a red pepper is healthy for our brain. And the answer to that is yes, but so are green peppers and yellow peppers and broccoli and a whole bunch of other foods. And so it's really trying to pull back and look at the broad context of the food that we're eating rather than worrying about single foods or single spices or single nutrients.
Right, absolutely. And I was going to talk about sort of this overwhelm when it comes to these rules that people need to follow when it's about eating a brain healthy diet. So there's some rules around, you have to eat your omega-3s, you have to consume a certain amount of antioxidants. And I think that becomes problematic in that it, as you mentioned, it directs people to focus on one sort of type of food when they shouldn't be sort of having this narrow-minded view of what they need to sort of consume to have an overarching, overall healthy approach to nutrition for their brain.
I couldn't agree with what you're saying more. And I think to a certain extent for me, it's, food and nutrition, well, food in particular plays a huge number of roles in our lives. So absolutely it's the source of the nutrients that we need. But it also has a very strong social context in our lives. And I think the more that we focus on the nutrients, that we are at risk of losing that social context. And that social context is so important because it keeps us engaged, it keeps us connected, it brings joy into our lives. And so not only is it overwhelming, I think, in terms of, should I be eating, broccoli today, or is it a cabbage day, or how do I get my omega-3s in? But I think it's also, we're losing that social context of food. And I think that in and of itself is an important aspect of how our lifestyle contributes to brain health.
And so when you talk about social context of food, are you talking about the actual act of eating and eating together with people?
Absolutely. And so, we know that when you look at components of healthy aging and healthy brain aging, maintaining that, sort of social connectiveness, keeping yourself cognitively engaged. If you look at all of the acts that one goes about in terms of preparing meals, and, cognitively you've got to work out time schedules and all of those types of things. You have family over, it keeps your network going, and that social connectedness. So I would say that the stimulation of the brain around all of those healthy activities that go with eating are also important in terms of ways that our diet can contribute to our health.
Right, absolutely. And so the next question I wanted to ask you was around tips that you had for listeners about how to incorporate healthier foods into their everyday lives. And as you've just mentioned, one of those tips is to consider that social context and engaging with your community and your family and your friends when creating these healthy meals. But are there any other sort of overarching food rules that you can share with listeners about how to ensure they're eating the right types of food to keep their brain healthy for as long as possible?
Well, I know for certain, I think we all recognize that if it's not in our refrigerator, we're not going to eat it. And the same way that we recognize with foods that we should eat less of, that we're more likely to consume them if they're stocking our pantry. So looking in terms of making that shopping activity is probably where it all begins. And particularly now as we're trying to encourage people to move more towards plant-based diets, to make certain that there's a good selection of foods that you can rapidly make into meals that are plant-based. So whether it's kind of making certain that you have the heartier vegetables, like the cauliflowers and the broccolis that can easily go into a salad or a pasta or something like that. Making certain that you have, sort of canned beans that you can mix into salads, into soups. So I would say keeping that pantry stocked with the core of what's needed for the plant-based diet is a piece of it. As I say that, I think it's also important to realize that when we say that we need to go towards the plant-based diet, that doesn't mean that we have to absolutely abstain from meat. That we're really just saying that we should be reducing our reliance on it.
And do you have one or two maybe of your favorite brain healthy recipes that you would like to share with the listeners?
Well, and I think it's a lot of it is when I was thinking it's tips. So. Right. For instance, the other day I was opening a can of tuna, and so if you look it's very common, in particularly out of Italy with that tuna, is that you would mix it with some white beans and some chopped red pepper, or chopped red onion, and then just add a little bit of red wine vinegar and olive oil. So, rather than going on the heavier mayonnaises and things like that, that's more into the North American culture to lighten it up with the vinaigrettes, but also use it as an opportunity to add beans at the same time. So it's, I think, making those small changes are the important ones. The other is something like salmon in its flavor really pairs very well with lentils. And so the other night I was making some salmon, and so we had some lentils where I had just, fried some carrots and celery and onion and heated the lentils in it. With the leftover lentils the next day, then I chopped, tomatoes and peppers and celery and used it to make a large salad. So I think it's a lot of it is trying to, as I say, having the foods available, and using them in ways that you can, take the leftover lentils from one night and turn it into a salad the next. So it's really kind of keeping fluid, and that you're not getting rigid, as you were talking about earlier, in terms of worrying about every item that's going to go into your mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's super important, especially the piece around not having the unhealthy, quick foods that you can consume, because if they are in the house and you're hungry, you're sort of helpless against going to eat that bag of chips if you're starving and that's the only thing that you can quickly eat. Versus if that is at the corner store, It's like, are you really going to go out and go get the bag of chips, or are you just going to prepare something with the healthy food that you have available in your own home?
Yeah, exactly. Particularly if you don't have a lot of sort of discretionary money in order to be able to buy fresh produce at this time of year.
Right.
And so, I think everyone has really gotten used to having frozen berries and fruit in their freezers that can easily turn into smoothies. So making a quick breakfast. But that fruit can also quite easily go into something like a crisp. And the crisp toppings, which are, really just oatmeal and flour and brown sugar, you can actually make those in batches and keep them in the refrigerator or the freezer so that you can quickly, again, pull together something because you've already got the crisp topping there and you've got the fruit that's in the freezer. So keeping it convenient, I think, is a really important part of it.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are termed healthy fats, why they're good for us, and in what foods we can find them. Because I know that it's often talked a lot about in terms of brain health, because our brains are predominantly made out of fat, and for it to be working and functioning in its most efficient way, it actually requires these healthy fats to help sustain function. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So there's I think two important pieces here. So one is anything around fat that we know that is heart healthy at the same time is going to be brain healthy. And a lot of that comes back to what I was saying before, and that it's really important that we keep our blood vessels healthy, because if we start to get any kind of blockage, obviously our brain is not going to be well fed. So keeping away from the saturated fats, going more towards the monounsaturated fats, the types of fats that are in olive oil, which are kind of key to a lot of the heart healthy, is going to be there. And maintaining the blood vessels is really why we're doing it in terms of brain health as well.
Right.
If you look uniquely at the brain, that's really when the story of the omega-3s come in, because not only, as you were saying, is the brain made up of a lot of fat, but of any organ in the body, it would have the highest concentration of the omega-3 fats. And those are fats that we need to eat. We can't make them in our body. And so we primarily think of them as wanting to come from fish sources, and that's really because the omega-3 is in the lengths that we want it. Fatty acids have different lengths of different chain lengths, and it's the lengths that we want it to be incorporated into the brain. On the other hand, we can also get omega-3s from nuts, flax seeds, other foods, and the body can easily turn them into the omega-3 fats that we want for the brain. So the omega-3 story, I would say, while it's important from a heart health perspective, that the brain is even more dependent on the fact that we're eating diets that are rich in omega-3s, but avoiding the saturated fats that we would find predominantly in any kind of fat that's hard at room temperature, that a lot of that probably relates more to maintaining the health of our blood vessels.
Right. And I was wondering if you could debunk something I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not. I hear sort of mixed results on this about the impact of cooking olive oil, because I know that olive oil is good for us and it's that good, healthy fat that we need. But I've heard that when you heat olive oil, it actually counteracts that good function that it has.
Yeah. So that can be said of any fat.
Okay.
So when we talk about fats either being saturated or unsaturated, it really is referring to whether or not they have something that we call a double bond. So the double bond is what makes a fat unsaturated, and those double bonds can be broken if there's in the face of a lot of heat, and then they turn into compounds that are less healthy for the body. Now, any oil that you would heat to a high temperature that would have those double bonds in it, you're going to get them broken, and that fat is going to deteriorate with cooking. So some fats are felt to be able to withstand heat better than others. And somehow or another, olive oil has somewhat gotten caught in those arguments, in that people are saying that it is that it's one of those fats that doesn't withstand heat as well as some of the others. And the reality is it's probably middle of the road in terms of its ability to withstand heat. So as long as you're not frying at ultra high temperatures, you're fine with the olive oil. And what you shouldn't be doing ever when you're cooking with oil is allowing it to heat to get to the point where it's smoking, because once it's smoking, you know it's breaking down.
Okay. That's an excellent tip.
Medium heat olive oil is fine.
Okay, great. I'm glad to know that because I've been so curious. And so thank you so much for clarifying that. I was wondering if you had any tips for listeners in terms of reading and interpreting nutritional information, because there's a lot of information on, the sides of food items. And so is there sort of some components that we should be paying more attention to than others? Like, for example, in terms of the saturated fat content or the sodium content, for example?
Well, I think we need to, stay as away from all of those things as much as possible. And I'm not sure whether it would be fair to say that, the saturated fats are more negative than the high salt. At the end of the day, I think really what it's telling us is that the more we move back to whole foods, the better off we are. And that if you look at where we get the saturated fats and the salts and the simple sugars in our diet, it's generally in pre-prepared packaged foods, and many of which are sweet or salty in terms of our snacks. And it's really saying that we can treat ourselves with those, but we shouldn't have a constant diet of them. And at the end of the day, I think we all know that, but it's reinforcing. So if you look at, for instance, what's come out with the new Canadian Food Guide that's just recently been launched, I mean, it really comes back to, kind of really reinforcing that the more we move back to, kind of the whole foods, the better off we are. So it's arguing that, half of our plate should be plant-based vegetable, fruit in origin, that about a quarter of it should be sources of protein, but that really needs to go across vegetable-based proteins as well as animal-based proteins, and then we need some grain. So keeping there, I think, and if you keep yourself focused on that, then you're not having to worry as much about, kind of the saturated fats and the salts and the simple sugars, because you're only going to buy those cookies and potato chips and pretzels on occasion and use them as a treat.
Right, absolutely. And as you mentioned before, not having them sort of stocked in your pantry just in case, because when they're there, that sort of increases the likelihood that we're going to consume that when we have a certain craving.
Oh, sure. I mean, we all get the midnight munchies. We're all human.
Yeah, exactly.
And if that carton of ice cream or bag of chocolate chip cookies is there, you're going to go to that before you're going to go to carrot sticks. But if you don't have ice cream or chocolate chip cookies in the house, then you're going to reach for the apple or the carrot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the current research projects that you and your colleagues at Baycrest are working on around the benefits of a healthy diet on the brain. If there's any information you wanted to share with the listeners.
Yep. So we've in the last little while actually developed something that we call the Brain Health Food Guide, and that's really drawing on the scientific evidence in terms of what diets seem to be best associated with retention of cognitive function as we age, and thankfully it's very similar to our new Canadian Food Guide. We're in the process of actually running a clinical trial where we're combining healthy eating with exercise. So it's a clinical trial. It's 6 months that we're having people come in and helping support in terms of changing lifestyle as it relates to, diet and exercise. So that trial we're still recruiting into. There are other trials going on at Baycrest, many of which, particularly from a prevention perspective or retaining cognition with aging, are looking at other aspects of lifestyle that we know are important, and then looking at ways that we can support people to adopt those healthier lifestyles.
And how can people find out more about getting involved in these research opportunities?
The Baycrest website is probably the best way to do that. We can also leave you with a telephone number in terms of having people know who to call. We've got a number of people actually that really help with our volunteers of individuals who would be interested in not only knowing about but also participating in some of the studies that we have ongoing.
Wonderful. So you can send me that phone number and I will be sure to pass it on to the listeners. And so if listeners are interested in getting a copy of the Brain Health Food Guide that you talked about, or the Mindful ebook, the cookbook that you co-authored, where can they go to find that?
The Brain Health Food Guide, probably the easiest link is also on the Baycrest website, and that's available in English. There is a French version of the guide that is listed on a website in Quebec. Our pulling together of all of this was done collaboratively across Canada, so we have it in both languages. And again, I can send you the information on that. The cookbook, while it was originally available both in hard copy and ebook, the hard copy is no longer available. So any ebook purveyors can have the book. So whether you go through Chapters Indigo or go directly to Amazon or one of the other locations where you can buy the ebook, it's still available.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you today. I learned so much about brain health.
It's been my pleasure, actually.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day. To learn more about the clinical trials taking place at Baycrest to investigate the impact of healthy eating and exercise on improving blood flow to the brain and improving our mental performance, such as memory and thinking abilities, you can visit the Baycrest website or call Kaljani Mahalingam at 416-785-2500, extension 3315. And be sure to indicate that you're interested in the diet and exercise study or the study on lifestyle behaviors. All of this information about how to get involved in the research at Baycrest, as well as the links to download the Brain Health Food Guide in English or in French, can be found back on our website at brainshape.ca/episode 4. As Carol mentioned, you can get her Mindful e-cookbook wherever ebooks are sold. That's spelled MINDFULL. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this episode gave you a lot of valuable information about what it means to eat healthy brain foods and provided you with some tangible tips about how to incorporate healthy foods and healthy eating habits into your life. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so that you'll be notified every time we publish a new episode. And since we're a weekly show, I'll see you back here next week, where we'll be talking to a registered dietitian about Canada's new food guide, busting myths about healthy eating habits, and getting tangible tips to help ensure you're reaching your nutritional goals. In the meantime, you can follow me on social media at BrainShapeTO, and be sure to let me know if there are any specific topics that you want me to cover on the show. Until next time, keep your brain in shape. And as always, I've had such a great time hanging out with you.